Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the Fintech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's FinTech Blueprint conversation. We are thrilled to have with us today Marc Boiron, who is the CEO of Polygon Labs, which is the labs company behind the Polygon protocol. I'm super excited to talk to Marc about his background in blockchain and law, and then increasingly in operating in the crypto space and the transformation of protocols, most recently towards much more commercial and focused use cases. So with that, Marc, welcome to the conversation.
Hey, Lex, thanks for having me.
Let's go to the beginning and talk a little bit about your legal career. How did you enter the law? What brought you to it? What pulled you to it? And which areas of the law did you focus on first?
For me, like the legal background was pretty much accidental. I wanted to be an investment banker, which is kind of a strange thing to want to be. And, you know, my dad at one point when I was going to go do an MBA, it was like, you should just get a law degree too. You know, lawyers are well respected. It'll set you up well. And I was like, sure, why don't I just throw in a law degree while I'm at it? And so I decided to do like a joint JD MBA, and, you know, very thankful for that because I spent a summer in New York at an investment bank and I just really did not enjoy it. Like I thought it would be a very different experience. I very much pictured the partner and then like investor side of kind of like the investment banking, like the relationship side of it. Very much did not picture I'm going to sit in front of a spreadsheet and just make up numbers so that, you know, whatever I want to make happen will happen. And so I pivoted from that and being more business oriented, my goal was how do I get into law in an area that is very close to finance in some way. And so I went to a law firm where I focused on just mergers and acquisitions of big public companies. The first 3 years of my career, basically like taking Dell private when Michael Dell was taking it private, for example. And so that was kind of like the beginning of legal days. But the thing that I found really quickly was when you're working on these big deals that like are very high profile, you're not really actually having like any meaningful impact from my perspective. And so when I decided to move out to California, I decided to go to like a smaller firm where, you know, even as a young lawyer, I would have an ability to like build up a book of business and kind of control my own kind of destiny. And so went to a firm where I kept doing M&A work, but it allowed me to start working with like emerging companies, just early stage companies, helping them raise capital. And that was to me like a much more interesting path because at that point, you kind of convert almost from being a lawyer in many ways to actually just being a salesperson. I often say that, you know, a partner at a law firm is just a glorified salesperson. And I wasn't a partner as a, you know, fourth year associate doing that, but very much had the opportunity to basically be engaged in sales all day long. And so that's kind of like where I spent a lot of my time in like the relatively early days, actually, of being a lawyer.
I'm going to be a little bit self-indulgent and geek out here because I was also cursed with the JD MBA. I think when we did it, they still took 4 years and required 2 separate applications into the business and the law school, and were generally pretty difficult to achieve. I still get questions about why should you do a JD MBA, you know, and is it worth it? And I always say that it's like a horrible cost-benefit analysis, but it is something that people often get just to like collect gold stars and because they want the accomplishment. What do you say to people who ask whether that degree is something worth pursuing and why?
Yeah, so I think I'm pretty like counter to the rest of the world on this, I think, which is that I think it's incredibly valuable for a set of people who want to be high earners with low risk. And that is
which is why we're both in crypto, right? That's definitely what it is.
Exactly.
As tokens go to zero and everybody gets deported.
Yeah. So the way that I looked at it, at least at the time, was here's a way that I could make more money than most people could imagine. And I'm going to sell my soul and life for it. But I am going to be able to do that and invest that capital like very successfully in a way that like most people wouldn't. And I have like no risk. So I can take really low risk capital, aggressively invest that low risk capital that is like a pretty significant amount. And that to me was like a good trade. And, knowing me like, and how I actually am, like, was that actually a good trade? Like, no. But there are a set of people, there's a lot of people who are very much unwilling to take risk. And being able to trade like 4 years of like, really hard work for the potential to earn more money than they could probably earn doing almost anything else. Because these are not people who are going to go start companies. They're not people who are going to go to early stage startups and get equity. That is a really good path for that set of people. And so I'm an advocate for that. Now, do I want my kids doing that? No, because I want them to have a much higher risk profile, be willing to take that risk at a young age, have lots of losses, but eventually be successful early, learn a lot from it. But I do think there's a profile where it definitely still makes a lot of sense.
How big was the JD MBA class for you?
Yeah, it was relatively small. I was at Penn State. The overlap was probably 10 people. Yeah, that's about right.
So at Columbia, it was for the 4 years of the overlap, it was like 10, 15 people. And there were two profiles of people. It was the lawyers who wanted the business stuff. And a lot of them went into kind of bankruptcy and, like credit funds, but they wanted to have like that financial experience. Then there was actually the opposite profile, which was people who wanted to do high-end financial services management. So around this time, if I remember, like at least in my career, one of my mentors who at one point was the CFO of Lehman Brothers was a JD MBA. And then the guy running Merrill Lynch during the financial crisis was a JD MBA. And the CEO of Goldman Sachs was a JD. And so it felt like this is the thing you get, if you want to deal with complicated social systems and you want exposure to financial services, like this is the degree you get. I wonder what it's like for people today, whether it's still the same respect for it or not.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about that. And I remember when I looked at like making this decision at the time, I think it was somewhere between 30 and 40% of all public company, like Fortune 500 CEOs were lawyers. And that was like really interesting to me and something that was actually like relevant to me being like, okay, yeah, like this makes sense to go get a JD if I'm a business guy. And I think a lot of that has to do with like the regulatory moat that you benefit from as many businesses. And that's, I think, much truer 15 years ago than it is today. And I think like having that background was probably helpful, but it's also like, I think, for those who can escape the paranoia of lawyers and actually take the benefits of, the way you break down information and analyze things and put that together with a risk profile that is necessary to run a company. I think you can do that really well and probably better than many others who don't have that background.
Yeah, because you end up with a legal skill set is so much intellectual firepower, but it's all aimed at like shutting things down instead of growing, that you do end up with kind of very few people who can turn it around into, as you said, sales and so on. So if we shift to you starting to kind of be on the partner track at the smaller firm, looking at emerging tech companies, orient us a little bit sort of with the first blockchain or crypto focused work that you started to encounter. When was that, and what kind of things were on the docket?
Yeah, so this was in early 2017, and it was very intentional. Like in late 2016, I'd been out of law school for just over 4 years, and I said, okay, I am doing the same kind of work as, at least a million other lawyers in the world. And that is not how you are successful. You should find a niche that you can land in and then go expand in. And so I went and kind of thought about what are the areas that have a significant amount of potential that I have some interest in and that I think is going to grow in a very meaningful way. And at that time, there's two things that came up. There was 3D printing and it was, blockchains. And 3D printing was the thing that had the most massive potential at the time, is how everybody looked at it. From an industrial perspective, it was growing super fast. But, I had somebody make a presentation at our law firm about how you successfully run a law practice. And he was very focused on doing the thing that you love. And he was an automotive guy and he would hang out at garages and racetracks all weekend. And he would just become friends with these people, mostly because it was the thing he wanted to do. It's who he wanted to hang out with. And he ended up just having all his friends call him. And that is who, his $5 million book of business was based off of, just his friends calling him from, the car track and the garage. And at first I thought that was BS because I'm a very big believer in work hard and be successful. But I thought about it and I'm I've been reading about this Ethereum thing that I'm obsessed with for the last year. Why don't I go look at whether the blockchain thing really is something that has potential? So this was early 2017, a little bit before ICOs started blowing up. But there's starting to be some meetups around the idea of crypto. And right as I kind of started getting into it is when the ICO craze kind of started taking off. And, I just happened to be hanging out with all of these people who were really interested in blockchains at the time. All of the crazy ideas that you heard that now are coming back around and are actually viable, I'd be just talking about those. And, everyone wanted to really quickly start launching a token. And I still remember the first project and the founders. Somebody I still know, when he laughs about how much I faked it until I made it. I was, a fourth year associate who was hey, I can run this ICO for you from this, small law firm when, it's all these major law firms that are actually the ones helping people out. And so, the first one was really, helping somebody out who wanted to launch a token. And, it was, I think the typical thing to start out with at the time.
What were the legal issues that clients were reaching out to you about? What were the problems that you were starting to see?
Yeah, it's really based on two key things. Were the SEC issues around tokens being securities or not. Very quickly, there was the Ether Delta kind of guidance from the SEC around the Ether Delta as a debt and how that would be regulated, and then the associated tokens. And then it was money transmitter issues that FinCEN had been very early into crypto. And so had guidance on that. And I, whether fortunate or unfortunate, had a very different, legal background. When I graduated law school, I did my M&A practice in Delaware at this firm that nobody in the world knows except for lawyers. And if you ask a lawyer about the firm, they will all tell you it is the best firm in the US or maybe the world, because all this firm does is it advises other law firms. So what would happen is you'd be on an M&A deal and you'd have every major law firm in the world, from, the Scattons to the LatAms and so on, that would call you and say, hey, what do we do about this issue? And what you were expected to do was know the law like the back of your hand. So a lot of legal practices, intuition, you learn things, you draft things. In Delaware, it was, you were going to remember these 300 pages of the law and every single case that has ever come out of the Delaware courts. And when a partner from a major law firm calls you, you're going to be able to tell them the answer to their question immediately. And when you review an M&A agreement, you're going to be able to advise on that. And so what I learned was, learn the law. Don't just learn how people have done things historically, which is how most lawyers learn things. And so when I got interested in this, the first thing that I did, weirdly enough, was I actually opened up the Securities Act and the Exchange Act, like the actual laws, and I like straight up just read them. And I read them like multiple times. And these are like hundreds of pages. I then read every bit of fintech guidance that touched crypto in any way whatsoever. And that's kind of how I like faked it till I made it, was I just understood the actual law itself. And this was really meaningful for crypto because there was no guidance. There was no clarity. The best thing you could do was understand the law and advise based off of the law. It was not about, how have people historically done this, because there was no people have historically done this. And so that was kind of like how I got into to really advise on crypto, was just understand the law like deeply as a fourth year associate in a way, frankly, that I think most partners never understood, because they never actually fully read the Securities Act or the Exchange Act in their 20 years of practice, because they didn't need to.
One of the things that we have in this industry, I think, are because of the early rhetorical positions or, regulation by enforcement positions of the various agencies and a lack of harmony between the agencies, is some really creative legal work to structure around the lack of that clarity. I find the legal structure of the crypto industry to be completely psychotic, like so extremely unaligned with, outcomes. So, for example, we've come to accept that protocols have to have a foundation, and the foundation is a nonprofit, and the nonprofit cuts grants that are not investment grants, but are sort of like just giving money away grants to various ecosystem projects. Like, that direction has spawned a whole cottage industry of things around protocols as this like nonprofit entity, and then the separation of the labs entity. And of course, that'll take us to Polygon, but like the separation of like the commercial labs entity from the token, it just pulls apart all of these incentives in ways that, again, I think don't do the right work. Or alternately, if we look at token launches have these ideas of vesting for investors, 4-year vests with cliffs and so on, which are kind of ish anchored by this idea of progressive decentralization, but also sort of anchored by the idea of market control and in part inspired by the equity markets. But then the practical outcome is complete nonsense. Like it's just a non-workable situation. And I feel like so much of our market structure has come out of needing to dance around the formation moment and needing to sidestep the regulatory authorities who had almost no give for this industry at start. Does that framing resonate with you? Am I getting it wrong? How would you respond to that thinking, especially given that you were sort of seeing it early on as some of these legal primitives for the industry developed?
I strongly agree with you. And this has come from somebody who I think shaped a lot of that. So a lot of the work that I did in, starting in 2019, I was probably the first lawyer who spent his time in DeFi. So, all the major DeFi names, from the compounds to the Uniswaps, those were all clients who I advised them on, frankly, everything that they were doing from a legal perspective. There were hundreds of pages on memos of this, help them launch their tokens, help them form kind of everything that they did. And the evolution of how DeFi-based token launches happened were mostly my creation. Obviously, others were doing it as well, but in the context of DeFi, pretty much nobody was. Like, everyone sent clients over to me because they said, I want to do what Compound did. I want to do what Uniswap did. I want to do what XYZ. And, I look at it as a complete Frankenstein, and I hate it. And I think you nailed it in what you described, even though I drove so much of that, because I didn't drive it from a business perspective. It was not a good business outcome. It was necessary from a legal perspective. If you did not do that, then there is a good likelihood that you would have been sued out of existence. And therefore you had to. And so the strategy was always twofold. One was, how do you look like a good actor, right? How do you do things in a way where if we are wrong on the law, it doesn't look like you intentionally were trying to violate the law. I think that's one very important approach. And I believe that to be true all the time. You don't want to look like somebody who doesn't care about the law and ignores it. And then the second one was, how do you, when you do get attacked by the regulators, which you will, right, back then how do you put yourself in a position where you can at least defend yourself? And you can either disincentivize the regulators from coming after you. You can put yourself in a good enough position that they don't want to continue to come after you, or you can straight up just win the case. And that was the whole idea behind that. The problem with it is, as you pointed out, it's impossible to run a business when you've got two businesses that are both crucial to the success of the project that you're working on, but they are at arm's length from one another, or at least are trying to appear as if they're arm's length from one another, with different leaders and different operations. How do we really execute on that? And I think the ones who ended up doing this best are the ones who knew how to push back on lawyers properly. Because I would say, as a lawyer, or as a CEO, as a founder, your job is not to just take legal advice and sit there and say, cool, thank you, I'm going to do exactly what you say. I think anyone who does that is in really big trouble. Your job is to listen to that, understand it, and push back where it's going to hurt your business. And I think the ones who did that most successfully did best. And I think those who just straight up listened to every bit of advice ended up in a spot where it was very hard for them to operate successfully. And the Frankenstein that you described persisted. But I will say that this perception of, labs and foundation as a separate thing continuing to persist today is, I think, a reflection of the lack of sophistication in the industry in many cases, because what often happens is everyone just does what others have done. And we can talk about this in the context of Polygon, but when I became this first chief legal officer before being CEO at Polygon, the first thing that I did was actually do the opposite of what I had done over the last 4 years when it came to other projects. And there were very specific reasons why I felt comfortable doing it, but I did do it differently for that reason. So long way of saying I just strongly agree with your description.
It's fascinating to hear that from you. And I think it's just evidence of the challenges that this industry, which has absolutely, revolutionized financial services and given it a new life after sort of the stagnation of the Web 2 approach, has been prevented for a long time from reaching its potential. Which takes me to, before we get into Polygon, kind of rounding out the legal topic. When we were in the sort of anti-crypto era, there was the debanking and the issues that you've mentioned. And there were a lot of players who were very much caught in the middle, trying to play this game of even though we're being innovators, we are trying to be responsible. Sometimes we can't follow the letter of the law because the letter of the law has been written at a time when we didn't have computers and mail was all physical and there was no such thing as millisecond algorithmic trading, right? And a lot of these players kind of weren't able to be really successful or were not extractive like others during the time when the industry was very tightly controlled. And then you fast forward to the current administration, and it's a complete 180-degree turn from, you can do nothing at all to everything's allowed, even the worst. And the first thing that happens is the Trump and Melania meme coins, which are both immediately scalped by very obviously criminals like Kelsier Ventures that went on to steal money from the Libra meme coin launch. And, all of this is expanded into Meteora and Jupiter and Solana, and it's like promoted to the highest audience possible, right? So we go from this kind of Stockholm syndrome situation to the people who are the most aggressive and completely disregarding of any good behavior are the ones who captured the pump.fun meme token launches, right? All the stuff that's sort of been the downfall of the industry in the last 2 years. Can you reflect on that sort of just dissonance? I mean, as somebody who's always preferred the middle path, I find it to be so disorienting to navigate that.
Look, I think that we've, as an industry, and obviously without the help of regulators, have often had this issue of perception that has held the industry back in some meaningful ways. I think some useful things being built has been a problem, frankly, but I do think that perception has been an issue. And look, one of the beauties of the technology is its permissionless nature. Like it is what really interested me in Ethereum in the first place. And when you get that, you are going to get the biggest grifts you can possibly find because nothing's stopping them from doing it. And it's in a way that moves much faster than other potential grifts. And people are going to take advantage of that. And there's nothing that can really be done about that, frankly. But it's also the nature of blockchains that also allow for the rest of the technology that we're building, that where that permissionlessness ends up being used for good. And so given my belief in like the permissionless nature of it, I do think people should be able to do the things that they are interested in doing on blockchain. Grifting not being one of them. That's, generally illegal activity that's being undertaken that I don't think is okay. When I look at things like meme coins, it's a weird thing in our society that right now, the way most people spend their time engaging in finance is through some form of semi-gambling in one way or another. That is what they do. They want a big win in some way. Meme coins are a form of that. Options trading on Robinhood are another form of that. GameStop's another form of that. We talk about it in the context of crypto as being the only thing, but the reality is it's like where we are as a society is one that is very much preferring a all or nothing outcome in finance than the stable cash flows that Warren Buffett would tell you should be the thing you should be focused on. And so meme coins are reflective of that. And personally, I think it is bad for the industry. At the same time, I personally think we've built permissions networks that people choose to use in the way that they want. And if people choose to express their desires, where I'm going to go all or nothing on a meme coin, they should have the right to do that. I personally don't spend my time on that. I think that, having a use case that is sustainable and brings something real to the world is much more exciting. And I think building a blockchain that is focused on doing that means that you can have a bigger impact. And so that's where I spend my time.
Prediction markets and poly market, I think, is also a useful footnote. A lot of that comes from the generational squeeze and people not feeling like the traditional path to success is no longer available, and sort of like this unfairness, generational unfairness that the only rational answer to is to buy lottery tickets. Let's put that to the side and switch over to Polygon. Polygon, I think at the time when you took over, had just taken this very strong position in the ecosystem. It was the first really commercially successful at the time sidechain to Ethereum. And I think a lot of the framing of it was kind of similar to today's framing of the layer twos, although that's moving on, where it was, Polygon is Ethereum. And I do wonder what that means. Like, how can Polygon be Ethereum when Polygon is Polygon and has its own token and so on? But again, like going back to 22, 23, you had an enormous rush into NFTs, which just meant that the media and gaming companies were coming in, and Polygon had a really successful business development arm focused on the media industry, creating lots and lots of sort of headline partnerships, whether it was Starbucks or the Nike NFTs. But then we had the FTX collapse and everything changed in a way that has been difficult to recover from. Can you take us back to that moment and maybe refresh like what that Polygon of 2023 looked like? And then from there, we can start to think about the future.
So yeah, when I joined Polygon as the CLO, it was definitely at the time where Polygon was high flying, both in having been incredibly successful in DeFi. And I mean, it was the place you went for DeFi. You didn't go anywhere else. Polygon was the place. Cindy, when he founded Polygon, his goal was always, I want to bring real use cases to the world. It's always been what he wanted to do. And so the second he saw the opportunity, he turned in that direction, which is, Polygon had, a $30 billion token, over $10 billion of TVL. And it had the opportunity to go and try to bring real world use cases in with large enterprises who had the distribution and could make an impact. So that was like very appealing to me. It was really this idea of like, we can bring real use cases to people. And so, when I joined, it was definitely exciting, right? It was every corporate in America, frankly, was considering working with Polygon in one form or another. And frankly, can't remember. I think it's a close to 50% of the Fortune 500 actually did in one way or another. Most people don't realize that. But two problems existed at the time. First is the technology still wasn't good enough, right? Polygon ran very smoothly. It was very cheap. It was very fast. But everything that you needed around it, from the wallets, the RPC providers, they just weren't stable enough. They weren't easy enough to use. And so And definitely like the regulatory landscape was such that everything being done was exploratory in nature. And whether it becomes something more was very, very unclear. And then the second thing that happened that you touched on is the FTX collapse. So I think there's a whole other world in which, Polygon doesn't go through the journey that we've been on where, FTX doesn't collapse and corporate America continues to experiment with, blockchain technology and slowly starts incorporating more of it into their products and what they do in a way that we're starting to see now with, more on the stablecoin side of things. But that wasn't what happened. And so when Sandeep asked me to take over as CEO, it was actually a really interesting time for Polygon, because externally, Polygon was the place to be. It was everything was being done right. But the interesting dynamic that I thought a lot was, do I step into this role at a point where externally Polygon looks incredibly successful, but internally it was extremely problematic? And specifically, we knew that enterprises coming into the space was no longer viable, but the company had grown like 10x internally in months, all with the expertise being outside of anything in Web3 meaningful at all. Everybody was from FANG in one way or another, had no idea what a blockchain was, didn't understand the economics of a blockchain or how to grow a blockchain in any way whatsoever. And for Polygon to survive, like, we had to go back to building things from a more like Web3 centric perspective, which is when I took the CEO role. And so that was actually one of the more interesting things for me, was this dichotomy of what the world saw externally versus what was actually happening internally. And my view being, I'm brought in to turn this around when the whole world was thinking Polygon is actually at its most successful moment. And so that's one that I think about a lot. And I think we're actually back when I look at like where Polygon is positioned now and what we're doing, and we'll talk about that. But it's been like a long journey to go from we very successfully have brought in, corporate America to corporate America doesn't want to touch this technology. Where do we go now? To not only corporate America, but everybody wants this technology again, but for a much more narrow use case than we originally imagined.
A lot of that resonates. Obviously, at Consensus, we did a lot of this around Ethereum. But during this moment between 23 and 26, there was like this attention drain for DeFi into the layer twos, the rise of Arbitrum, now the rise of Hyperliquid, Solana as a meme coin platform, which has sort of pushed a lot of the gambling activity into those areas. But also in the last 2 years, we've had the rise and adoption of stablecoins, where for whatever reason, if you call a token a stablecoin, people get really excited, which is sort of astounding to me. Like, yeah, you like tokens. That's nice. And now you've had the legislation around it and everything. But the acquisition of Bridge by Stripe's sort of aggressive movement into building their own alt chain. Circle, the issuer of USDC, and their aggressive movement towards issuing their own chain, building their own chain. Obviously, you've got Tether, and with Tether, you've got 2 different stablecoin chains, a layer 2 and an alt chain. At our venture fund, we see a lot of pitches and even made some investments. We have a East Asia stablecoin chain, a Western stablecoin chain, and there's been a lot of kind of adoption and excitement around stablecoins replacing the Web2 fintech approach of embedded finance and sort of scotch taping bank accounts into apps, which hasn't worked well and has resulted in lots of money being lost. But then there's like this incredible amount of competition around stablecoin chains and stablecoins and all of that. Recently, from the outside, it appears that Polygon's made kind of operating company acquisitions around payments and is driving in this direction successfully, capturing meaningful volume. How would you characterize the competitive environment, and then what is the business strategy, business model for Polygon to navigate this sort of fairly saturated situation?
I do think it's incredibly competitive. When we decided to start focusing on payments, this was maybe obviously the thing we spent most time talking about. Was payments is an incredibly competitive space, both in terms of incumbents, but also those who want to come into payments from a more like a Web3 stablecoin first perspective. And there are a couple of things that influenced our decision for moving forward with it. The first one was the size of the opportunity. It's just that simple. We're very much like past the question of how, like, will stablecoins take off? Will they be used broadly? Will they replace the way we move money completely or only partially? And the bet that we took is that it'll replace the way that we move money completely. This is why our mission is to move all money on chain. Our view is that my view is that in 10 years, all money will exist on chain, whether that's tokenized deposits or stable coins, doesn't matter. They will be moving on blockchain based rails. If I'm wrong about that, Polygon's going to fail. I don't think I'm wrong about that. And therefore we was willing to take a bet on it. And when taking that bet and thinking of that competition, first of all, is I always like to win. And I think that winning means $1 trillion opportunity. And that is very exciting to me. And I think to everyone who is in the ecosystem. But failing to win does not mean you end up with a very bad outcome for everyone involved. You could probably be the 50th or 100th most successful payments company focused on stablecoins. And just because the entire stablecoin industry or on-chain money movement industry takes over the way we move money today, you will end up being one of the more successful companies in the next decade. And so I view it as relatively low risk from a competitiveness perspective, simply because the best move you can always make is be in an industry that is going to grow at massive multiples, in which case everybody's going to end up being successful. And the question is only degree of success. And then I say everybody, obviously not everybody, but I think those who execute well are going to do well. And so that was kind of like some baseline analysis and thought process that we had on the Polygon side. Now, for us, most people think of us as we are in payments now because they saw our acquisitions. This actually started about 12 months ago. So Polygon has already done over $2.3 trillion of stablecoin movement on the chain. And I'm saying specifically like stablecoins. It is a chain that's been around for a long time. It has been battle tested. The volumes that Polymarket currently does in USDC on Polygon is not something literally any other chain has seen yet. And when we looked at 12 months ago how the chain was actually being used, what we realized was there was 10 different ways the chain was being used. And we were trying to capture this whole thing. And it goes back to the point that I made when I was looking at what do I do as a lawyer? I was like, do I do this thing that everybody is competing in that is generalized? Or do I find a niche to go compete in where I can have a much bigger impact? And I think this weird thing that grew in the crypto world of blockchains do everything is going to get decimated as a concept. I think it already is decimated as a concept. And the simple reason is because, 5 years ago, being fast and cheap was a differentiator. And it made a lot of sense to focus on being fast and cheap for any use case possible because there were hardly any use cases. But today, that doesn't make sense because being generalized, blockchains and having generalized block space just means that you're giving somebody else the opportunity to do something better than you are. And that doing something better happens in multiple ways, right? It's not just from a technical perspective. It's also from a social perspective. It's from a legitimacy perspective, relationships. So a little over 12 months ago, I was just looking at the space as a whole and I was chatting with Sandeep and I just said, man, we can't keep trying to do everything. Like all blockchains are coming around to a similar design, right? I think in 2 years from now, it'll be very hard to see the differences between blockchains and you're already starting to see them. Yes, there's a difference between like L1s and L2s, but when you start looking at L1s, do you see any real differences? When you start looking at L2s, do you see? Not really, honestly. And so you start needing to differentiate yourself in another way. And when we looked at everything that we did, what we actually realized was that we were doing incredibly well in payments. And it is an area that we've had a team focused on for 4 years now, but it was just one of the many things that we did. But when we looked at those numbers, we also looked at where our reputation is strong. And it goes back to the question you asked earlier about, the 2022s and 2023s of unintentionally building a reputation in the enterprise and fintech world that people know Polygon in many cases because of the work that we did back then. And even if they don't know us, all they need to go do is do a little bit of research to know that Starbucks has already diligenced Polygon and Revolut had already diligenced Polygon. And, Stripe was already defaulting to Polygon for almost everything that they do on a chain. And that is the type of thing that when you're dealing with enterprises and fintechs are really, really important. And so we saw that we had an opportunity there. Now, the question, so I often, when I think about this and I split the world between like the crypto, like Web3 approach and then like incumbents, while I will like never just like assume that somebody's not going to outcompete us because I'm just always going to be petrified of being outcompeted. It's the only way I'll make sure I don't get outcompeted. I looked at Polygon and just nobody is even close in the crypto world to what we've done. Like it's just not comparable when it comes to like payments. And that gave me a lot of confidence that to the extent you have an advantage from coming from that perspective, Polygon is well positioned. So the question then becomes, what about everybody who's going to come into crypto that is currently in the payment space that has the opportunity to outcompete us? And there's a few things that we thought were important. And I have like expanded my views on this partially from, John Egan joined us. He was heading crypto at Stripe. He joined us about 6 months ago. And a lot of it had to do with, a lot of its conversations I've had with him, I'm like, look, Stripe's been super like crypto forward. Like, why did you choose to join us when you were at a place where you already crafted one of the better strategies to execute on? And you could have continued to execute on that. And, John basically said, well, I just like to look at who has like a right to win that people don't recognize yet. And what he means by that is who is well positioned to be successful that has not yet been recognized. And the thing about Polygon is when you've done trillions of transactions, you have relationships everywhere. You have a unique advantage. First is all of these other blockchains that are launching, they literally don't exist. They like to tout speed. They like to tout, specific attributes that they have. They don't exist. Polygon exists. It does, often over 100 transactions per second. It can do thousands of transactions per second and has done them live in production for years in a stable way with fintechs in LatAm, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, in the US, all using them. Revolut's done over $1 billion on Polygon, like Taza pays over $1 billion now. You've got significant, actual usage for payments purposes. And that is not something that others can actually say and prove. Now, the question is, can you build off of that successfully to compete with existing payments companies and distributions? And I think the answer is very much yes. First is there's a mindset difference. When we approach things, we don't have existing businesses to protect. I don't need to on-ramp somebody and off-ramp somebody to make my bips. All I need to do is get them on the chain and keep them on the chain. Give them something useful to do on the chain and give them investments to hold, give them ways to earn and make the money movement better and smoother for them. When they want confidentiality, we have it on Polygon. They can have confidentiality they want for those transfers. I just need to make it better. I don't need to protect that business. Second is payments companies are not global by nature. They're very regional by nature. Like any name that you think about that is really leaning into crypto and blockchain right now, they don't have the presence that we have. It's very weird to say of massive companies that we are competing with, but who don't have the LatAm relationships that we have, the African relationships that we have, the Southeast Asian relationships that we have. And that's led to any fintech in LatAm that is on a blockchain. Same thing in Africa, and mostly true in Southeast Asia, is on Polygon. They're usually supporting other chains too, but you will definitely see Polygon in there. And so we look at all of that, and our perspective is we have a huge lead. People just don't realize it yet. And the question is, can we actually successfully build on that lead? And that's where some of the acquisitions that we've made are intended to help accelerate that and really make kind of the Polygon the home of blockchains. I'll stop there. You asked me about strategy, but I've talked for so long that maybe I'll stop there for a second.
No, that's fantastic. I'm super excited to see how it develops. It feels like the right strategy. And to your point, there are a series of really positive outcomes because payments is too big to be a winner-take-all market. And there's lots of space. If you were to direct our audience to learn more about Polygon or about you, where should they go?
I'm 0x Marc B on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. You can find Polygon on both LinkedIn and on Twitter. But if you go to Polygon's page, visit the Open Money Stack. It's really core to our strategy. One API that allows companies to move stablecoins all around the world from off the chain to on a chain, across chains, and on the chain. And ultimately, we got to make stablecoins super easy to use. And that's ultimately what we're going to do. And so I think, go check out the Open Money Stack. It's a really cool product that is core to our strategy and that I think is going to change the way stablecoins get adopted. And so, that's really it. And really appreciate it. This is a fun conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.